Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important and timely event today on extrajudicial executions in Colombia. Earlier today, Colombia took steps towards revealing the truth about the conduct, rights abuses, and modalities employed by actors in the 50-year plus conflict. The Truth Commission earlier this morning had a listening event with two arch enemies linked to atrocities suffered by victims, Rodrigo Londoño, the ex-FARC commander, and Salvatore Mancuso, the ex-AUC commander. While this was just a preliminary event where both agreed to reveal the truth moving forward, it shows that Colombia's 2016 peace accord is advancing in bringing victims and many others the necessary information required to stop repetition of grave crimes. Sadly, what has been glaringly missing in much of the transitional justice process has been the willingness of the Colombian government to engage fully in the process and to support it robustly. Today, we will be talking about that other actor, which is the Colombian government's armed forces and the extrajudicial killings that they committed during the armed conflict. In February, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, commonly known as the HEP in its acronym, revealed that in Colombia, the armed forces had committed at least 6,402 extrajudicial killings between the year 2002 to 2008. Today, we had initially planned to have Sergeant Carlos Eduard Mora speak. Why? Because he is an example of someone who, despite the tremendous pressure and risk, did the right thing. Mora was part of Colombia's 15th Brigade in Ocaña when he observed that there were inconsistencies taking place in terms of the combat deaths, and that members of his battalion were responsible for some of the counterinsurgency statistics that were questionable. In 2008, he took the bold step of denouncing his colleagues for killing civilians and later passing them on as enemy combatants. These extrajudicial killings that are termed erroneously as false positive were widespread and throughout the country, and also led to a scandal when 19 young men were murdered from the southwestern neighborhood of Soacha, and that was revealed and uncovered. Mora has suffered greatly for his role as a whistleblower, having faced multiple types of retaliation, including public humiliations and death threats. His security situation became so grave that his case went before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, who issued in 2013 that the Colombian state, ironically who he was working for, protect him and his family. We wish to say at this point that we urge all US authorities and others who are listening today that they pressure the Colombian government to guarantee that Mora's safety and his family's safety and security remain safe, and that there is a stop to any further reprisals against him for being a whistleblower. We will be following his situation very closely and informing the US Congress and others should any further attacks continue. Another reason we had invited Mora was because he is Afro-Colombian, and the persecution he faced, coupled with the structural racism which is embedded in all institutions of Colombian society, and which in the armed forces is an institution that's not free from the broader society, added another layer of difficulty, both because he was Black and because he was a whistleblower. We thought it would be important to start discussing that situation. We have heard of that situation, multiple soldiers, and racism in situations where you have command structure and hazing that form part of the unofficial training is particularly egregious. So we hope we can do another event in the future about this. Today, we are going to start with a very short 2-minute video of Sergeant Mora's presentation that he presented in front of the transitional justice system. Then we will hear a presentation from Alberto Yepes, the coordinator for the Observatory of Human Rights of the Coordinación Colombia-Europa-Estados Unidos, which is a national network of 285 human rights organizations, including all the highest profile ones and social organizations. The Colombia-Europa-Estados Unidos has a working table or working group that basically documents and follows extrajudicial cases. They've published at least 12 reports on this, several of whom have been presented to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and to the Prosecutor's Office of the International Criminal Court. We've also been fortunate to have Alberto and other representatives of Colombia, Europa, Estados Unidos present these reports in the United States. He will be followed by my colleague, Adam Isaacson, who directs WOLA's Defense Oversight Program, which monitors U.S. cooperation with Latin America security forces, as well as the security trends. So he tracks U.S. military and police training, arms transfer, security engagements, and what the implications are for human rights and civil military relations throughout the Americas. Colombia has been close to Adam's heart since he's worked on it for many, many years, since 1994, and also because since much of the focus of US security assistance in the 1990s and afterwards was focused on Colombia, he's followed all of this very closely for many years. He and I also work together on peace process implementation and where human rights overlap with us. So with that, I would like to go ahead and start with the video.
Yo soy el sargento segundo Carlos Eduardo Mora del Ejército Nacional. Yo en el año del 2008 denuncié a algunos superiores, compañeros y subalternos por el asesinato de personas civiles para hacerlas pasar como enemigos muertos en combate, lo que se conoce como falsos positivos. Las consecuencias que tuvo esto para mí fueron diversas, familiares, psicológicas, inclusive hasta económicas, pero no solo consecuencias malas, sino que creo consecuencias buenas también, ¿no? Dar a conocer lo que había pasado, saber que se puede mejorar, saber que podemos cambiar, ha sido consecuencias no solo malas, sino también buenas, aparte de amenazas y otras cosas. ¿Cómo se supera una situación como estas? Es algo que se va trabajando, se va construyendo, superar todo esto. Se supera cuando usted se da cuenta que lo que hizo es correcto, se supera cuando usted se da cuenta que su familia está orgullosa por lo que usted hizo, se supera cuando usted se da cuenta que compañeros suyos de la fuerza lo apoyan. Entonces es un constante, no hay un momento de quiebre o de superación como tal. ¿Qué hacer para que no se repita? Tristemente cuando olvidamos volvemos a cometer los mismos errores, entonces es importante saber todo lo que pasó, cómo pasó, por qué pasó y no dejar que se olvide. Recordarlo, tenerlo siempre en cuenta para que no volvamos a cometer esos errores.
Great. So now we're going to start with Alberto Yepes. Alberto, por favor.
Buenas tardes. Ante todo, muy agradecido a WOLA por la invitación. Y gustoso de hablar de este tema, que soy uno de los ejes del debate público en los temas de verdad y justicia. Escuchando pues el testimonio del sargento Mora, pues es una situación en la que muchas personas en Colombia han caído cuando denuncian, cuando son testigos, cuando llevan sus casos ante la justicia. Las situaciones de amenazas y de riesgos no se dejan esperar. Hay toda una estrategia para negar la ocurrencia de este triste fenómeno de las ejecuciones extrajudiciales, que como se sabe, la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz logró documentar solamente entre 2002 y 2008 6.402 casos. Eso ha generado mucha conmoción, como si fuera una sorpresa. pero las cifras se conocían desde mucho antes. Desde el año 2010, la Coordinación Colombia-Europa-Estados Unidos había documentado cerca de 6.000 casos que tenían nombres y apellidos y lugar donde fueron perpetrados y la fecha. Pero nunca la justicia quiso actuar. En el año 2015, el informe de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de Naciones Unidas documentó con registros de la Fiscalía cerca de 5.000 casos. En ese momento nada se dijo, tal vez porque no había ninguna perspectiva de que fueran judicializados los responsables detrás de estos crímenes, los máximos determinadores. Entonces ahora vienen con una sorpresa, pero las cifras ya se conocían desde mucho antes. Solamente que con los cambios en la Fiscalía, especialmente desde el ingreso del señor Néstor Humberto Martínez, hubo una extraña actividad de escamoteo de las cifras y de ocultamiento de los datos. La Fiscalía solamente reportó 2.248 casos cuando durante la gestión del anterior fiscal Montealegre, efectivamente la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de Naciones Unidas pudo documentar que tenían registros de casi 5.000 víctimas. El informe que la Fiscalía de Montealegre entregó a la JEP solamente menciona una tercera parte de las víctimas que realmente eran conocidas y que habían sido denunciadas. Eso demuestra una operación de encubrimiento y de impunidad, no solamente ocultando 2/3 partes de las víctimas de esto, sino omitiendo investigaciones por los responsables de 2/3 partes de esos casos de ejecuciones. Es decir, 4.154 casos más de los que reportó la Fiscalía ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz fueron documentados con distintas fuentes, entre ellos el Observatorio de Memoria del Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica, el CINEP, y los datos de la Coordinación Colombia-Europa-Estados Unidos. Pero no solamente fueron bases de datos, fueron también datos aportados por los propios comparecientes que fueron revelando verdades sobre casos que la Fiscalía no había reportado. Por ejemplo, en las 4 jornadas de exhumaciones que se han hecho en el cementerio de Dabeiba, han sido ya rescatados cerca de 80 cadáveres de personas que tenían síntomas, indicios de corresponder a casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales en la modalidad de falsos positivos. Personas que estaban sus cadáveres estaban en bolsas plásticas, muchos de ellos con manos amarradas o pies amarrados, con vendas, con prendas militares que se les habían puesto. Es imposible que personas con manos amarradas y pies amarrados hubieran muerto en combate. Eso, digamos, son signos evidentes de que el fenómeno va mucho más allá de lo que las propias bases de datos pueden reportar. En todo esto, digamos, ha habido una política clara, orientada desde el Estado, que se evidencia en múltiples factores. Por ejemplo, el hecho de que haya habido en el año 2002, después del ascenso al poder del expresidente Álvaro Uribe, un incremento tan dramático en el número de casos denunciados de ejecuciones extrajudiciales, que fue incrementándose año tras año hasta el año 2008. Pero la sola llegada a Uribe implicó un 138% de incremento de denuncias de casos por ejecuciones extrajudiciales en el primer año de gobierno de Álvaro Uribe. Es imposible, digamos, que eso hubiera sucedido por una mera unión de voluntades de personal de baja y media graduación. Hubo grupos especiales dentro de brigadas a los cuales se encomendaban este tipo de operaciones que han sido denunciados en varias ocasiones, los denominados grupos Delta, que llevaban a cabo este tipo de ejecuciones. Hubo directivas expresas como la directiva 029 del año 2005, que ofrecía pagos monetarios en dinero hasta 3.800.000 pesos por personas reportadas como muertes en combate. A pesar de que el expresidente diga que esa directiva nunca fue usada en muchos expedientes y en anotaciones de cuadernos militares, están registros de esas recompensas pagadas. Inclusive casos que involucran al anterior comandante del Ejército Nacional, Nicasio Martínez, en la cual se pagó recompensa por la muerte de una niña indígena de 13 años, a la cual reportaron como persona muerta en combate. Es decir, son muchos, son abundantes los casos de pagos de recompensas. Hubo también muchas declaraciones de oficiales del ejército que mencionaban las presiones que recibían del alto mando militar, especialmente del general Montoya, expresiones como que querían litros de sangre, que no les servían los detenidos, que no servían los capturados, que no servían los desmovilizados, que necesitaban eran muertos. Y efectivamente, el hecho de que se haya descubierto que había un ranking de las brigadas y los batallones que tenían el mayor número de bajas, donde los que ocupaban los primeros puestos eran quienes efectivamente mostraban mayor número de bajas reportadas. Todo esto pues configura elementos para deducir que hubo una política de Estado para producir estas bajas de muertes de civiles indefensos, para hacerlos aparecer como éxitos de operaciones militares, para hacerlo aparecer como resultados exitosos de la política de seguridad democrática que en ese momento quería mostrar grandes cifras y grandes resultados contra el combate contra las guerrillas. El gobierno de Uribe mencionó que entre el año 2002 y 2010, 15.200 personas fueron muertas en combate. Pero entre los años 2002 y 2008, los reportes fueron de 11.460 personas presuntas muertes en combate. 11.460 personas, pero si ahora se ha encontrado que esas 6.402 correspondieron a civiles muertos de manera indefensa, quiere decir que el 56% de las personas reportadas como bajas en combate fueron civiles muertos en estado de indefensión. Es decir, que fue efectivamente una política intencionada a asesinar civiles y cobrar beneficios por ello, que no eran solamente en dinero, sino en días de descanso para los soldados, ascensos, viajes al exterior y algunos incentivos monetarios. No solamente, digamos, estos hechos permanecen en la mayor parte en la impunidad, porque de estos casos solamente hay 1.282 condenas, 2.862 sentencias que involucran solamente el 24% de los casos reportados como ejecuciones extrajudiciales. Pero aún, digamos, en este 24% de los casos, no puede decirse que sea un esclarecimiento completo de los hechos y que efectivamente hayan superado la impunidad. ¿Por qué razón? Porque estas 1.282 condenas han caído en su mayor parte sobre soldados y personal de media y baja graduación. No hay un solo general, no hay un solo comandante de brigada, no hay un solo comandante de división que haya sido condenado por este tipo de hechos. Y es imposible pensar que cifras tan masivas de miles y miles producidas en tan corto número de años hayan sido producidos solamente por la voluntad de personal de soldados y personal de baja graduación. Esto requería una red completa de complicidades, una red completa de consentimientos, pero también para llevar de manera clandestina y encubierta este tipo de políticas. También no solamente la impunidad se evidencia en el hecho de que la Fiscalía nunca tuvo la decisión de investigar a los altos mandos comprometidos en este tipo de crímenes. Los procesos por esto siempre estuvieron frenados, paralizados con múltiples pretextos, a tal punto que la Fiscalía de la Corte Penal Internacional desde hace más de 5 años viene presionando y exigiendo resultados sobre 29 generales cuyas brigadas militares mostraron los mayores números de registros de casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales mientras ellos estuvieron al mando. Y ha pedido insistentemente resultados a la Fiscalía sobre estos 29 generales, pero ninguna actividad hay, digamos, no hay ninguna sentencia frente a ninguno de estos 29 generales sobre los cuales la Fiscalía de la Corte Penal Internacional ha llamado ya a la atención de que deben producirse resultados por los datos exagerados de personas muertas, civiles muertos en indefensión mientras estuvieron al mando. Los casos se han paralizado completamente en la Fiscalía General de la Nación. Las investigaciones no han avanzado desde la firma del proceso de paz con un pretexto. El pretexto es que las investigaciones ya pasaron a la JEP, que la competencia es ahora de la JEP y no de la justicia ordinaria, pero en esto hay una falacia. Tanto las normas que rigen la JEP como el propio acuerdo de paz planteaban la obligación de que la justicia tenía que continuar las investigaciones por este tipo de crímenes hasta tanto la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz en su sala de reconocimiento anunciara con 3 meses de anticipación que iba a cerrarse los casos, que se iba a producir una resolución de conclusiones y pidiera que se le enviara el expediente. Nada de esto se ha hecho y en tanto no hay incentivos positivos para que los altos mandos se presenten, en tanto no hay decisiones avanzadas de la justicia, no van a tener la voluntad de presentarse. ¿Quiénes se han presentado ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz? Hay unos 2.300 militares que se han presentado, que eran básicamente los que estaban condenados, que estaban en la cárcel, soldados y personal de media y baja graduación, que se han presentado a la JEP para obtener su libertad, han salido en libertad, y algunos pocos mandos militares que se cuentan con los dedos de la mano, que se han aprovechado de los beneficios de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz para paralizar sus procesos, para frenar los procesos de investigación en la justicia ordinaria, tal como ha sucedido con uno de los máximos arquitectos de esta política, el general Mario Montoya Uribe, que curiosamente ha llegado a la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz a decir que ninguna responsabilidad tuvo en esos hechos y a descargar la responsabilidad en los soldados, diciendo que se produjeron estos crímenes porque los soldados no entendían órdenes, eran soldados con muy baja educación, a los cuales él les decía que había que respetar los derechos y ellos entendían que eso significaba matar personas y producir bajas. Es decir, es una burla a las víctimas decir que ninguna responsabilidad tenía el oficial que estuvo al mando de las épocas en que mayor número de ejecuciones extrajudiciales se perpetraron. Para nosotros es preocupante el hecho también de que algunos de esos oficiales de rango medio que han comenzado a hablar han tenido riesgos y amenazas como las que está produciendo que está sufriendo el sargento Mora. La Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz ha tenido que producir en un auto medidas dirigidas a que se garantice la protección de 20 oficiales que han sufrido amenazas e inclusive atentados por haber declarado contra sus superiores en la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Esto es supremamente grave y evidencia la existencia de una operación de impunidad, de una operación de silencio para que no se conozca la verdad en estos casos. Sumado a eso, ha habido directivas del alto mando de la fuerza pública, como una directiva del anterior comandante del ejército, Nicasio Martínez, directiva en la que se señalaba la configuración de un equipo de alto nivel para construir una narrativa unificada que deberían vertir los mandos militares que se estaban sometiendo al sistema integral de verdad, justicia y reparación, conteniendo las versiones que deberían rendir ante la Comisión de la Verdad y ante estas instancias. Efectivamente, lo que han observado los abogados de las organizaciones de derechos humanos que representan víctimas es que ha habido casi una clonación de las versiones que están rindiendo muchos oficiales que están dando sus versiones ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Y también eso llevó a que la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz tuviera que emitir un auto ordenando investigar actividades de abogados de la defensa militar que están agrupados en una entidad denominada el Fondetec, que depende del Ministerio de Defensa y que con fondos públicos financia a los abogados para la defensa de los militares. Oficiales han declarado que se les ha llevado antes de las versiones a capacitaciones en guarniciones militares, donde se les ha advertido de que no deben en sus versiones mencionar a los mandos en sus declaraciones. Este tipo de presiones pues se ha extendido también a presiones a los abogados que representan las víctimas, como ha sucedido con el caso de Germán Romero, que justamente ha sido denunciado ante la justicia por denunciar este tipo de acciones irregulares de los abogados de la defensa, e inclusive amenazas directas contra abogados que representan víctimas, como el caso de Sebastián Escobar, del colectivo de abogados José Alvear Restrepo, y que es uno de los abogados que representa víctimas ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, quien en su propio teléfono recibió amenazas cuando una persona que está sometida ante la JEP le puso 2 semanas para que compareciera a contar la verdad. En este caso, él y su protegido han recibido amenazas, de tal manera que es también grave el hecho de que oficiales de alto mando, como el propio comandante del ejército, mencione al día siguiente que se produzca este fallo de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz y que se mencione que entre las fuentes de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz estaban bases de datos de organizaciones no gubernamentales, que se trataba de víboras perversas y venenosas que querían amedrentar a la fuerza pública. Ese lenguaje de alguna manera significa una advertencia y una amenaza y un riesgo grande, tanto para la JEP como para las propias organizaciones. El propio Partido Centro Democrático y el propio señor expresidente Uribe, pues en sus redes sociales han proferido amenazas de que todas estas denuncias de los casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz se deben a organizaciones que eran enemigas de su gobierno, organizaciones que buscan hacerle un daño al gobierno y menoscabar la imagen del expresidente Uribe. Aparte de eso, algunos oficiales que han salido recientemente del mando han mencionado en redes sociales como el comandante, como el brigadier general Buitrago de inteligencia de la Policía Nacional, que la Coordinación Colombia-Europa-Estados Unidos y la OIDACO pues son cajas de resonancia de los grupos terroristas en Colombia y que actuamos conjuntamente con el Ejército de Liberación Nacional y las FARC. Igualmente, otros oficiales pues han señalado que las organizaciones de derechos humanos son enemigos perversos de las instituciones. Todo esto pues ha generado un clima de riesgo, de incertidumbre, que busca básicamente impedir que la verdad avance ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Sumado a eso, pues la continuidad de casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales bajo este gobierno que se han de nuevo reactivado y que tienen que ver con la selección en la cúpula militar de mandos militares que estuvieron implicados antes en casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales y que han sido justamente los seleccionados para los ascensos militares y para ocupar los primeros cargos en la jerarquía militar. Y hemos tenido casos de militares que se han sometido a la JEP, que han obtenido por ello la libertad y han sido ubicados en altos cargos en la cúpula militar y conduciendo tropas han producido nuevos casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales. como el general Diego Luis Villegas, cuyas tropas produjeron la ejecución extrajudicial del desmovilizado de las FARC, Dimar Torres, a pesar de que este señor se había sometido ante la JEP, había estado ya detenido y obtuvo su libertad y fue reubicado, digamos, al mando de esto. Así otros mandos en otras divisiones que han tenido casos anteriormente de ejecuciones extrajudiciales, están mandando tropas cuyas unidades han producido casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales. Casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales que últimamente pues, han tenido modalidades como las que se han producido en protestas contra erradicaciones de cultivos ilícitos, en las cuales han muerto por las balas oficiales cerca de 16 personas. Y lo más lamentable, los casos de muertes en bombardeos, como los que se dieron en agosto del 2019 o los que se dieron solamente pues, hace unas 2 semanas, en las cuales parecen coincidir con otra de las directivas nefastas del anterior comandante del ejército, Nicasio Martínez, según la cual se podían rebajar los índices de certeza de quienes podían ser blancos legítimos. Y por eso vemos que en estos operativos han caído niños menores de edad y la fuerza pública dice que no averiguó con anterioridad si en esos campamentos estaban personas reclutadas o no. Es decir, no se hizo el esfuerzo de verificar la información, si las personas estaban allí reclutadas por la fuerza, si habían niños, si habían menores de edad. Todo eso en concordancia con esa directiva de que se puede reducir el grado de certidumbre para ver quiénes pueden ser blancos legítimos de las operaciones militares, y por eso estamos viendo esta situación en la cual niños mueren en bombardeos militares, como se ha denunciado recientemente, con las justificaciones más absurdas, como que se están haciendo eso conforme a las normas del derecho internacional humanitario, que son operaciones legítimas, o que tal vez merecían morir porque esos niños son máquinas de guerra y después serían mucho más peligrosos. Todo esto pues configura una situación en la cual este gobierno ha reactivado la guerra y parece, digamos, que en esa situación hacia el futuro tendremos mucho más casos y se preparan para una guerra mucho más intensa como la que han anunciado con la compra de 24 nuevos bombarderos, aviones de guerra, a un costo de 4.500 millones de dólares, para lo cual dice tener la aprobación del gobierno de Estados Unidos para esta nueva fase de la guerra que se va a expresar en bombardeos, en ataques a campamentos donde hay personas reclutadas, en confrontación a personas que protestan por la erradicación de cultivos ilícitos, en muertes contra la protesta social, como los 13 personas asesinadas en Bogotá por la policía, que constituyeron también verdaderos casos de ejecuciones, porque eran personas que murieron ejerciendo derechos y libertades fundamentales, como el derecho a la protesta, en la que fueron asesinadas 13 personas en las noches del 9 y 10 de septiembre.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Alberto. Mencionaste un montón de información, pero una cosa que has resaltado es el papel y la conexión con Estados Unidos. Entonces, para hablar más sobre esto, tenemos a mi colega Adam. Adam, por favor.
Gracias, Jimena, y gracias por organizar este excelente evento. Y bueno, Jimena y Alberto y yo hemos estado trabajando en estos temas desde hace muchísimo tiempo. I'm going to actually switch to English just out of pure laziness. I mean, we have been working on this for a very long time, and we saw the false positives scandal unfold in real time. And just as we talk about this, I mean, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace came up with this number: 6,402 people killed in the course of the false positives scandal in their macro case that they're working on for this. 6,402 civilians murdered in 7 years. Just, how do we put that in our mind? How do we even figure out how big of a human rights crime that is? Well, one way we can sort of try to figure it out, and Alberto came up with a number that I don't have. I have a slightly different number, but a number of, okay, how many people did the Colombian armed forces claim to have killed during those 7 years of the conflict? To look for that, I looked at the 2014, actually released in early 2015, report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office in Colombia. They, at the very end of that report, they include a bunch of charts and tables where they tried to figure out from the Fiscalia, from military justice system, and then from the defense ministry, how many active cases of false positives were there and how many combat kills had the armed forces claimed. At the time, they came up with a very conservative estimate, really relying on the Fiscalia, of only 3,088 known cases of false positives, half as many, less than half, than what we now know, out of a universe of 14,735 people that the armed forces claimed to have killed in combat between 2002 and 2008. So by that math, UNHCR was saying that about 21% of those killed in the conflict had been fake, which is really alarming. That's 1 in 5. That's really bad. But wait, now with the new number from the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the 6,402, which I actually did find surprising, more than Alberto did apparently. But if you take that, that brings up the number up to 43.4% of all of the people that the armed forces claim to have killed in combat during those years may have actually been civilians killed extrajudicially. Now, I also like to save the periodic report on achievements of the defense policy of the Defense Ministry, which is still to this day posted every couple of months to the Defense Ministry's website. And here is the figure on the left of this slide from the February 2011 report. That one gives a figure of 12,908 people reported killed in combat. And if you use that, you're at just about exactly half of those killed. 6,402 were actually killed outside of combat. And if you use the figure that Alberto came up with, it's 56%. But even in the most conservative of those new estimates, 6,402 is more than 2 out of every 5 people killed by the Colombian security forces in the conflict may have been false positives, civilians, non-combatants at the time they were killed, extrajudicially executed. Think about that for a minute. This is happening, by the way, at a time, 2002 through 2008, when many years the United States was giving almost $2 million a day, the blue part of this graph, $2 million a day to the Colombian military and police at the very height of Plan Colombia. The United States was present for this. It really calls into doubt, for me especially, I mean, just this whole narrative of a success story. Yes, the military effort during those years ultimately brought the FARC to a weaker point where by 2012, its leaders agreed to negotiate peace. For a time, which was easily reversed, it lowered production of cocaine and coca. But it came, as we see now, at a very huge cost. And the tactics involved in actually bringing the FARC to the negotiating table really didn't involve extrajudicially executing civilians. This whole episode, it recalls a lot of old frustrations from doing human rights work in Colombia in the mid-2000s. Here is language from the 2004 UN High Commissioner for Human Rights report, which is one of the first times they really delved a little deeply into this phenomenon they were hearing about, particularly in Antioquia in 2003 and 2004, of an increased number of allegations that innocent people had been killed and dressed up in uniforms and presented as people killed in combat. Groups like the Coordinación Colombia Europa Estados Unidos with Alberto were already starting to document this and putting out reports. The Colombian Commission of Jurists, CINEP, and others were doing the same. But it wasn't getting traction, even when it showed up in UN reports like this. I didn't work for WULA at the time. I worked for a sister organization, but we would all meet together by law, as required by law, every 6 months with the State Department to discuss what the human rights situation in Colombia looked like. That was part of the human rights conditions attached to aid. At least once a year, we would meet with the commander of Southern Command through the Southern Command's Human Rights Initiative. And of course, what we were hearing from our partners in Colombia about these increased killings and these extrajudicial executions that were later faked as combat kills, that was usually one of the first things we would mention in the agenda. And yes, the State Department diplomats we talked to and the US military officers we talked to would raise this. They would raise it with the Fiscalia in Colombia, which at the time was headed by Luis Camilo Osorio and Mario Iguaran. They would, of course, raise it with their counterparts in the Colombian Armed Forces. And I'm paraphrasing, but they would generally come back to us in 2004, 2005, 2006, and 2007 and say, we raised this, and we were told that no, these actually were combat kills. or no, those people were guerrillas killed in combat. And maybe there were a couple of cases, but this is overblown. Everybody disputes those statistics. That kind of work really it highlights the important role of the work that Colombian NGOs were doing. And that's sort of the first character I want to really raise up in this story. The Colombian human rights community did very careful work accompanying victims and trying to document this as it was happening. And that's why work like those of the Colombian, or rather the Coordinación, has been such an important input to the databases that the special jurisdiction for peace are using. But we just, as I said, we just weren't getting traction on this in the mid 2000s. Now, this episode, though, also did ultimately start to show the importance of US foreign policy. What happened? At the very end of 2006, there was a midterm election in the United States, and the Democratic Party took over the majority in the House and Senate, and they took over key committee chairmanships with their hands on the spigot of US military assistance. Now, I'm not saying that human rights are not important to the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party over the last 30 years or so has been more willing to go to the mat, to hold up assistance even to friendly governments over human rights than Republicans have. So when Republican chair people, or rather when Democratic chair people have taken over the right committees, it has given new teeth to conditions in the law, allowing military assistance to be frozen or held up pending improvement in the Colombian Armed Forces accountability for past human rights abuses. So Senator Leahy there on the left takes over the subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate that's in charge of foreign aid. And now if he thinks that the conditions aren't being met, he can turn his hand, or rather turn the spigot off, and the aid stops flowing. And this was happening a lot as the human rights conditions got new teeth. We were hearing secondhand that the Colombian military in late 2007 into 2008 was complaining there wasn't even money at times for fuel for some of the helicopters because the United States contributions to those funds was on hold pending progress on past human rights cases. And then in September of 2008, maybe it was September of 2008, we heard the case of 20 men from Soacha, a poor suburb of Bogota, who had been enticed with an offer of employment and then showed up dead months later in uniform, hundreds of miles away near the Venezuelan border, and claimed as ex-combatants. The Soacha case, maybe because it happened at a place so close to Bogota, it blew the scandal open. Thousands of people had already been killed, but this is what really made it a big deal. President Uribe and then Defense Minister Santos had to fire some senior generals and senior officers, including generals. But it showed the importance of US policy that not only did we start seeing more verdicts, maybe not for the highest ranks, but we started seeing a lot more movement in the Colombian court system, but also, as I'll show you in a minute, the numbers started to go down. At the same time, though, and this is another, I've upheld the Colombian NGOs, the weight of US policy. I would also very much uphold the subject of today's session, the whistleblowers in Colombia, people on the inside who cared about their institution, who cared about their country, who weren't just going to keep their head down and go along to get along when they saw some very horrible things going on. You have Sergeant Mora, you have Edwin Guzman in the case of Colonel Mejia there. You have the Inspector General of the Army, actually, at the time after the Soacha case, came up with a very brave report recommending a lot of changes that have not all been put into practice, unfortunately. But you started seeing some verdicts, and you started seeing investigations. The civilian justice system started trying a lot of these cases, at least in the case of lower ranking people, and a few officers getting some results, as Alberto mentioned. And indeed, the military's behavior changed. Here's CINEP's count of how many extrajudicial executions they were finding. And after 2008, there's a precipitous drop because the incentive structure changed. The likelihood of being held accountable increased. And, over the next several years, into the 2010s, we started hearing fewer human rights complaints about the Colombian Armed Forces. We had a high command in the middle of the decade that was quite supportive of the peace process and rather reform-minded eventually. Unfortunately, in the past 2 or 3 years, we have seen some alarming backsliding in the Colombian Armed Forces under its current command. We saw it in early 2019. Alberto already mentioned the case of Dimar Torres, and that quote there, which I will not read to you, was given by General Villegas, whom he already mentioned. The killing by the military of a FARC ex-combatant completely out of combat in the Catatumbo region. Scandals about a possible return to body counts as a measure of success in 2019, which raised a lot of alarms, followed by a hunt inside the institution to try to pull out and identify the whistleblowers who had allowed those scandals to emerge. Corruption allegations that started to grow in the second half of 2019. A bombing of an encampment, similar to what just happened on March 2nd, a guerrilla dissident encampment that killed several child combatants who were at that encampment, about which the defense ministry covered up the information until it was revealed by opposition senators, which forced the defense minister to resign in November of 2019. Wiretapping, surveillance, and threats that we learned about early last year, followed by a scandal about military keeping files on civilians, human rights defenders, politicians, reporters, including US reporters. A counterintelligence operation that had begun within the military to try to root out corrupt and abusive elements as a condition or to go along with Colombia joining NATO, found some very horrific things about continued collaboration with organized crime, and in some cases even with guerrillas. But that Operation Baston lost a lot of its energy and started to wither under the current command that took over with the Duque government. Can I just say here, by the way, how much we miss Semana magazine? I keep showing covers from Colombia's news magazine, Semana, that did some wonderful investigative work and had great sources within the military with a lot of the whistleblowers. Semana has since changed ownership, changed direction, and there has been a mass exodus of all of the investigative reporters who are working with the whistleblowers to reveal a lot of this thing. And Semana is no longer a source of information for these things. In the middle of last year, there were sexual abuse scandals involving soldiers, particularly taking advantage of indigenous girls. And of course, as Alberto mentioned, at the HEP, at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, there have been pressures on soldiers who, the nearly 2,000 soldiers who have agreed to give evidence, pressures on them not to reveal information about senior officers' involvement in the false positives. And Alberto mentioned this tweeted video of snakes, which was what the commander of Colombia's army posted to Twitter the day after the Special Jurisdiction for Peace posted that 6,402 number. Rather than voice a desire to get to the bottom of this, to reveal the truth about what happened, rather than any expression of contrition toward victims, the commander of Colombia's US-aided armed forces posted a tweet comparing his critics to snakes. The mothers of false positives responded with a tweet saying, "How terrifying that these people are still in power. We are not snakes. We are victims of the armed forces." I think what happened to Gineth Bedoya just this week also shows how hard it is to be a victim in Colombia trying to get justice. Gineth Bedoya was an investigative reporter for El Tiempo, Colombia's largest newspaper, investigating crimes happening out of Colombia's prisons involving paramilitary groups who were in league with the military. She, at the prison door, was kidnapped, tortured, sexually abused, and has since spent 21 years trying to get justice against the paramilitaries, but also against the police and armed forces members and units that collaborated with them. Just on Monday, she had a hearing in the Inter-American Human Rights Court, which is where you go when you can't get justice in Colombia's regular court system. And the Colombian government's response was to get up. Well, they couldn't get up because it was virtual, but do the equivalent of getting up and walking out of the chamber and demanding that most of the justices be recused because they didn't feel they were partial. The court has since refused to do that, but just the struggle of Gineth Bedoya, who is not a poor campesina from a remote area. This is somebody who can actually defend herself and is a fighter. She's had to go for 21 years and is still getting slapped in the face. The fight of the victims is outrageous. And if we take anything out of this experience of false positives and the fight for accountability, the importance of non-governmental investigators, the importance of whistleblowers, and yes, the importance of having the United States, even if it makes a friend uncomfortable, being on the side of the people trying to get justice unequivocally makes a huge difference. That's a huge lesson we should take away from the experience of false positives, this bitter experience. Thank you for listening. I look forward to the discussion. And I will figure out how to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alberto. We hit many, many topics that in just a couple minutes we won't be able to go through, but I wanted to quickly mention some of the questions and give both of you the option to respond. So one of the questions that we got was, as all participating know, the US has long played an important role in influencing governments in Colombia in areas of counter-narcotics and security. However, I would argue that US decisions have typically and most often not been based on a granular knowledge of situations on the ground where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Organizations like WILA do have this granular knowledge. In an ideal world, I think that some sort of structure or committee or council, for example, whereby US officials and WILA experts could collaborate, and out of this structural collaboration might emerge, could improve US policy and make it more responsive to the needs of all Colombians. Am I dreaming when I think of this? What are the possibilities or constraints? So that's the first one. Second one is there a correlation between the Colombian unit officers that received US training and assistance and the undertaking of extrajudicial killings? Another question is, what are some actionable steps the US government during this administration can do to decrease violence against human rights defenders, including social and environmental defenders? And another question here is, as seen with the Colombian government's recent behavior at the Inter-American Commission, ongoing criticisms against the JEP and attacks against independent judiciary, it seems powerful factions are keen on obstructing the need of truth and justice in grave human rights abuses like these. How can we ensure whistleblowers and individuals contributing to justice are safe and able to be free from attacks? So I think those are plenty. And then just one other question, should these extrajudicial killings be prosecuted under the transitional justice system or the ordinary justice system? So I will let Alberto answer first. You can pick what you'd like to answer in 2 minutes, and then we will go to Adam.
Gracias por las preguntas. Son bien interesantes. Yo creo que las decisiones de los Estados Unidos pueden influir mucho en la posibilidad de detener los nuevos casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales y fortalecer la posibilidad de que militares que han tenido voluntad de denunciar estas estrategias, estas dinámicas y a los responsables de las mismas tengan condiciones para hacerlo ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Sin embargo, la responsabilidad no es solo de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, ni ella lo puede hacer sola. Mencioné que una de las dificultades para lograr que vayan a la JEP los máximos responsables es que no hay decisiones en la Fiscalía que los impliquen. Entonces, es necesario que los Estados Unidos también motiven a la Fiscalía General de la Nación a que avance las investigaciones. Los Estados Unidos entregan una cantidad gigantesca de cooperación a la Fiscalía General de la Nación, que si no se revierte en avances, en decisiones sobre los máximos responsables de graves violaciones de derechos humanos y especialmente de estos casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales, pues sería dinero perdido. Creo que la manera en que la JEP puede cumplir su labor es si la Fiscalía avanza las investigaciones hasta un punto en que por lo menos se llevan estas personas a juicio. Entendemos que no van que no puedan ser privados de libertad, pero sí por lo menos llevar hasta que se anuncie cuál es el sentido del juicio para que con ese estímulo puedan acudir ante la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. En segundo lugar, los Estados Unidos pueden frenar esta tendencia desbocada hacia la guerra que el gobierno de Colombia quiere imponer haciendo trizas la paz, y en lo cual está también el fiscal general de la Nación. Si escuchamos sus últimas declaraciones, todas buscan minimizar los logros de la paz e intensificar y distorsionar las operaciones de las organizaciones ilegales como medida para justificar la acción de la guerra. Y el gobierno de Duque está tratando de hacer hasta lo imposible por agradar a los sectores de la extrema derecha mundial y sobre todo la extrema de Estados Unidos, para que no detenga esta dinámica de guerra química, de guerra contra las drogas, de bombardeo, de militarización. Y creo que parar la guerra es generar las condiciones para que la justicia pueda actuar y efectivamente para que también se frenen todas estas dinámicas masivas, sistemáticas, pero implementadas de manera clandestina en contra de los líderes sociales, de los líderes medioambientales y de las organizaciones que están denunciando y buscando llevar ante la justicia a los perpetradores y responsables de estos tipos de crímenes. Los Estados Unidos tienen un papel muy grande en influir las decisiones del gobierno de Colombia, pero creemos que también la sociedad norteamericana debe tener también la posibilidad de frenar toda esta ola de decisiones en las cuales se busca agrandar, intensificar, distorsionar la realidad de la confrontación para justificar acciones de guerra y para continuar paralizando los avances en el proceso de paz y especialmente respaldando a la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz y a las organizaciones de víctimas que están llevando casos allí. Muchas gracias.
Very good questions. You know, I think one thing that we've seen the United States do over the years is not work with the worst units in the armed forces or the police. I mean, I think the brigade that leads the list in false positive, for instance, the 4th Brigade in Medellin, has never received direct U.S. assistance. Maybe the commander of the 4th Brigade gets to go to a conference or something now and then, but they know not even really to ask. And the Leahy Law, which bans assistance to units that grossly violate human rights with impunity, would not allow aid to units like that. However, there's certainly some units, some regional units that received U.S. assistance during this period have accusations of false positives occurring during their command. They are not among the most notorious of the units, but there are some. I don't have the list in front of me. And usually it's in the single digits, the numbers of murders. So what you get, though, is that the United States instead, over the years, has tended to work with newly created units, aviation brigades, counter-narcotics brigades, you know, the police anti-narcotics unit rather than the police writ large. And you end up, we see this elsewhere in Latin America too. You see the United States end up working with the military within the military, or police within the police. And in that military within the military, the officers tend to be more professional and more rights respecting and more educated. And it actually creates some resentments with the rest of the military quite often, that they're not, you know, in the club of prestige that belongs to the United States. But that is a pretty well-worn groove at this point. And it doesn't necessarily, it means that, you know, if the majority of the military is not accountable to human rights, if generals continue to advance in their careers, even after they've been involved in scandals, well, if those are not our generals, then U.S. pressure has not been brought to bear. I think it does start needing to be brought to bear. I think the United States is going to need to have more uncomfortable conversations with its ally, Colombia, the same way that I think the Biden administration has already begun having uncomfortable conversations with governments in Central America that make pro-U.S. noises, even as they engage in corruption or abuse. I think that we have to have that with elements within the Colombian Colombian state, really. And in doing so, uphold the parts of the Colombian state units within the Fiscalia, more reformist and whistleblowing moderate elements of the military, uphold them more clearly. Now, you know, I guess, what else would I say about this in the little time allotted to me? You know, a lot of this does run through the justice system, and I agree that the false positives in an ideal world should go through Colombia's regular criminal justice system. They were not an act of war. They were the hiring of criminals quite often to just kidnap people and kill them in order to show results. Really no direct relation to the armed conflict at all. That said, had this been left up to the civilian prosecutor's office, the Fiscalia, we would never have seen this number, 6,402. So I'm of two minds about this right now. I would like to see the HEP carry forward with its effort to learn the truth and bring justice to the victims and reach in their bottom-up methodology, reach the highest levels of the military to ascribe responsibilities. And while I'd rather the regular criminal justice system did that, I'm not at all confident that it has the political will to do so.
Thank you so much, Adam and Alberto. Yeah, in closing, I just want to mention once again, we deeply regret that Sergeant Mora wasn't able to join us today. And we reiterate that we are expecting that the US and Colombian authorities take every step to guarantee the safety of him and his family and to not allow for any reprisals against him, and that we will be monitoring that very closely and also informing the US Congress about it. What was mentioned by both Adam and Alberto is absolutely outrageous. And it's horrific to think that these are still taking place, and also that other forms of abuses are taking place, and that the rhetoric that we've heard just in the past week just points towards keeping that narrative going of trying to resolve Colombia's conflicts through militarization, criminalization, and stigmatization, not just from the Minister of Defense calling children machines of war, but also from the Presidential Advisor of Security, equating indigenous justice system with terrorists when they were just trying to protect themselves. All of this is really undermining the peace process, a peace process that is so important for so many in Colombia, but also a peace process that the US has invested a lot of money and effort into. So I would echo what Alberto said, that we in the United States need to do more. And it's not just our representatives, also us as civil society. We need to be able to also elevate the information so that more people in US civil society are aware of it and acting. With that, I'm going to close this event. And before closing, I would like to thank again our panelists and also Matthew and the translators and everyone who made this possible, and to invite you on April 7th at 10 a.m. to our next event, which will be about the Humanitarian Accord Now in Catatumbo, which is basically an initiative of the church and civil society and rural peasant organizations in Catatumbo to try to establish humanitarian minimums in that area of the country. So thank you again. And have a
Thank you,
great
Jimena. Gracias, Alberto.
Gracias.